I do think in evolutionary terms and across the time scale that evolutionary biologists and physicists have come to accept. And so that's a universe that's about 15 billion years old on a planet that's about 4.5 billion, and with life being 3.5 and mammalian life, say, being 60 million years. That's my time span. The biblical time span is much truncated in relationship to that. And that sets up a certain tension between the biblical stories, certainly if they're read as objective truth. Yeah. But the Catholic Church, from my understanding, has, and this comes from the Pope himself, the Catholic Church has already accepted the basic tenets of evolution. But I don't know, yes, is that wrong?
Sure. Oh, no, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. So, but that begs the question, because for me, and I'm sure this is part of the sticking point for young people, and maybe for people in Western culture in general, is that it's easy to say that evolutionary theory has been accepted, but that still begs the question. It's right. Okay. So fine. You can look at the span of life over 3.5 billion years before you get to human beings. But our religious stories talk of a reality that looks like it's about 15,000 years old, something like that.
Right.
And so that, I'm not blaming the church for that, obviously. And I think the stories in the Bible are far older than 5,000 to 10,000 years. I suspect they were part of an extraordinarily ancient oral tradition that stretches back tens of thousands of years, because that's the rule rather than the exception. And I don't know to what degree the Catholic thinkers within the church are working constantly to attempt to reconcile these two viewpoints, apart from saying that they do accept them both.
Yeah, but I don't think I think that they're apples and oranges in a way. I mean, I don't worry too much about that issue. I'm not trying to read the Bible as a scientific text. It's not about the evolutionary process. It's a theological and spiritual text that's discerning truths that are, I think, available within our experience. But they're discrete moments there. I mean, the scientist who talks about evolution, fine, I listen to him or her. The Bible's not concerned so much with that. But it's giving us a theological interpretation of history and indeed of the cosmos, but not in scientific terms. So it has implications for our understanding of the cosmos, for sure, and of nature, of human nature, but it's not done in a scientific manner. So it just predates, as you say, I mean, any of what we'd associate now with the scientific method. The last biblical text is around the year 100 AD, and so it long predates that preoccupation. So to me, it's like kind of an apples and oranges issue. And I think that a lot of that religion science stuff, in that sense, is an early 20th century preoccupation that we should just get beyond.
Right. But I think that may be the case, but I don't think people have gone beyond it. And,
no,
I also think that, and this pertains to something we also talked about discussing, which was the continual drain from the church, the Catholic Church, perhaps in particular, but perhaps not in the West, of young people. And I think part of that is their inability to make intellectual sense of everything that they're faced with, a religious tradition and a scientific tradition, especially on the biological front. But not only that, they don't know where to place these things in their view of the world. I think that's partly why my lectures, because you'd asked about that, had become popular, because I am trying to do that. And
no, I'll say this. You look at the surveys, there's a lot of surveys now that ask young people precisely that question: how come you left? And people speculate, oh, it must be because of the scandals or because, they had a bad experience in church or something. Number one reason across many years in all the surveys is, I don't believe the teachings. And then to specify that, religion and science seem to be at odds with each other. So for young people, the scientific way of knowing is the way of knowing. So it's sort of scientism, at least implicitly, holds sway in the minds of a lot of young people. So once you make that move, knowledge equals the scientific manner of knowing. Well, then the Bible is non-scientific. Therefore, it's, old superstition, Bronze Age mythology, etc. And see, what you were doing, Jordan, I think, you were doing what a lot of the church fathers did with the scriptures, because the church fathers are very interesting. People like Origen and Augustine and Chrysostom and those people. They knew fully well in the 3rd and 4th century that the Bible should not simply be read in a sort of, a straightforwardly literalistic way. Augustine knew that very clearly. Origen knew that clearly. And they talk, therefore, about the different senses of Scripture. What you're doing, I think, in a lot of your lectures is what Origen would have called the moral sense of the Bible, the tropological, to give it its kind of technical term. The biblical texts are about the moral life. Now, we might say today the psychological life, or what makes you psychologically healthy or more productive. They would have said the moral sense. They knew all about that. And so the texts begin to open up in these marvelous ways. So, Noah and the ark, Jacob and wrestling with the angel and the ladder going up to heaven, et cetera, et cetera. If you start fussing about, the literal truth of these stories, you're going to miss these really deep spiritual insights, which the church fathers knew very well. And I think you were in your own way tapping into that. And the fact that young people were responding to it, I think is very encouraging. That's why I told the bishops, it's a positive sign that you were getting the audiences you were getting around this.
Well, the problem with the scientific viewpoint, technically speaking, is that it's amoral within its own confines. By definition, it strives not to address issues of value. Now, it can't help it because scientists have to investigate some things and not others, so value enters into it. But by its own nature, science can't answer and tries not to answer questions of value. Now, it gets more complicated when you look at work like the primatology I discussed earlier, the origin of morality in animals and game playing, say, among rats. That starts to move into the domain of morality to some degree. But the problem with science is that it strips out all subjective meaning. It's designed to do that. And that leaves everyone at a loss about what to do with the world of value. And I do believe that stories in particular address the world of value. That's their function. And the world of value is the world that we act in. They're guides to action.
Well, I come across it all the time in my work on the internet. So I have, dialogues with people that interact with my videos, and they'll say things like, well, the sciences give us access to the truth, period. The scientific method, that's how you get to the truth. And I'll say, so Hamlet tells you nothing true. Plato tells you nothing true. T.S. Eliot's poetry tells you nothing true. I mean, who would believe that except the most ideologically scientific person? But see, my fear is a lot of young people are in the grip of that. They're in the grip of a real ideological science.
They don't know how to think their way out of it. And so they just abandon the attempt, but it leaves them nowhere.
What you were doing, though, is you're showing a way out. And there is a way out. And it's by, an introduction into the great masters of these texts to show you how they function. That's what a good preacher ought to be doing, So let me throw another objection, and this is another stumbling block, I think. And I think this emerges in postmodernism in particular, because the postmodernists, there's reasons for their manner of thinking. So one reason is, artificial intelligence researchers discovered in the early 1960s that perceiving the landscape was much more difficult than anybody had ever suspected. Originally, it was sort of felt that objects were just there in some simple way, and the complicated computational problem would be how to move among the obvious objects. But it turned out that it's really, really difficult to perceive the environment. There's an infinite or near infinite number of ways that you can perceive even a finite set of objects. So, and that means there's a multitude of potential interpretations for every set of events. And so that was a radical discovery in the computational world, but the same discovery basically occurred at the same time in the world of literary analysis for the same reason, is that every text is susceptible to an inordinately large number of interpretations, and it's not easy to identify the canonical interpretation. And maybe the canonical interpretation isn't canonical, it just serves power, for example. And that would be, religion as the opiate of the masses, or religion as a political tool. And I think that takes things far too far. But there's a real problem here, is that if you divorce the narrative from the objective world, and say, well, the narrative is valuable because it gives us a guide to value, then you have another problem which is, okay, which narrative? And how do we make a hierarchy of value among narratives? We would say Hamlet is deeper than Harlequin romance. Right.
But trying to specify why that is and what deep means is very, very difficult. And you might say, well, the Bible is the deepest of all narratives, but that still begs the question. Well, compared to Buddhist writings, say, compared to the Upanishads, or compared to any long-term complex mythology that's developed over thousands and thousands of years, what makes it canonical? Why is it preferable to Shakespeare, for example? And so, so perhaps I could get you to address that, because that's a vicious problem.
There's a lot there. And I'll start with your opening remark about postmodernism, because I quite agree with you. I'm not simply anti-postmodern. In fact, I wrote a book called Toward a Post-Liberal Catholicism, where I took in a lot of the insights of the postmoderns, one of which is, as you quite correctly say, a sort of legitimate perspectivalism, that we never get reality, too cool, right? Just open my eyes, there's reality. Again, that's Lonergan. It's only a properly constituted subjectivity that opens the door to the properly objective. But one of those ways of properly constituting your subjectivity is to put your subjectivity within a community of discourse. So it's never the case that I simply intuit the way things are and end of the argument. No, it's as Lonergan said, it's not the cogito. That was the trouble with the Enlightenment. It's the cogitamos. It's always we think. And that means I have my perspective. I bounce it off your perspective. You bounce it off somebody else's. We have a disciplined and structured conversation. And in that process, all the different aspects of the real begin to emerge. Or like my intellectual hero, John Henry Newman, said the contents of a real idea is equivalent to the sum total of its possible aspects. That's about 1870, he says that, which is really an extraordinary thing, because he anticipates in many ways the phenomenologists. When they talk about walking around an object and to intuit its essence thereby. And the walking around is not just I walk around, but you're walking around and someone else is walking around. And we're all exchanging our points of view. And again, I'd bring this into line with Catholicism, which has always stressed the communitarian element, that we know precisely in the community of the church. Now, linked to the Bible is never like, just open it up. You're a single subjective viewer. Now you take in its meaning. Well, no, we've always said the Bible is read within the church in this long interpretive tradition, where I'm bouncing it off of Augustine's perspective, who got it from Origen, who now throws it to Thomas Aquinas, who now brings it to Newman, and then through preachers and teachers, through the saints. So you've got the technical, intellectual interpretation of the Bible. Then you have the saints, who in many ways, they embody the Bible. So I'm going to read a lot of the biblical stories in light of Francis of Assisi, in light of Teresa of Calcutta, et cetera. So I like that side, if you want, of the postmodern, which is much more attuned to the communal way in which we come to know things. The big question you raised at the end, we could spend some time with that. How do you make ultimate judgments and determinations like this one is right, Well, you hinted at it a bit there by saying, well, look, many people have worked on this for a very, very long period of time. And in some sense, it's a living document. Yeah, right? Because it does have to be, the Bible just doesn't exist as a book on a shelf. It's a pattern of meaning within a context, and the context has to be taken into account. So you say, well, there's a powerful context for its interpretation. It's also a fundamental text in that the Bible is implicit in all sorts of other great texts, like Shakespeare, or anything that's a product of Judeo-Christian culture. That's a deep product, is deeply affected by the Bible. So it's there implicitly, whether you like it or not. And so it has to be taken seriously, I would say, even if you don't believe it. But then to the degree that you believe the central axioms of Western culture, you have to wonder how much of what's biblical you do end up believing because of its implicitness. Well, yeah, I mean, it's all through the Western culture for sure. And the question of belief, in some ways is the most fundamental question in all of theology. We call it fundamental theology. How do you articulate the meaning of belief? And, for the best people in our tradition, belief is always on the far side of reason, not the near side of reason. And that's a mistake that so many people make today, young people especially. Faith or belief, they mistake for credulity or superstition, something sub-rational. And our best people, of course, have always repudiated that. Authentic faith is on the far side of reason. So reason's done all the work it can and should do. But then there's this moment when the claim is made Deus dixit, right? That God has spoken. Now, do I believe that or not? I think it's precisely analogous to coming to know a person. So I know something about you just from watching you over the years, and I can Google you and I can read your books and I can come to some sort of objective knowledge of you. Now in this virtual means I've, met you. And so my mind is working, trying to understand where you're coming from. But let's, project into the future. If you and I met in person, you and I eventually became friends. And at some point, you spoke a truth about yourself that I could never have gotten on my own. I could never have gotten it from any objective source. You revealed something to me, right, of your inner life. And at that point, I've got to make a decision. Well, do I believe that or not? I can't prove it. I can't ratify it. It's congruent with everything I've known. So that's one test I could give. If you told me something that's just wildly incongruous with everything else I know about you, I'd probably not believe that. But if you tell me something that's congruent with what I know, but goes beyond it, and I have to say at that point, okay, I have to believe that or not. I think faith is like that in a way. So the Bible, I can approach in all kinds of different ways. But the claim being made at the heart of the Bible, of biblical revelation, is Deus dixit. God has spoken. God has said something in this text. Do I accept it? And that has to be a decision that's born of something beyond reason, not opposed to it, but beyond it. So that's, I think, where belief in the religious sense comes in.
So I understand that argument, but I have trouble with it, I would say. So we could talk about faith a little bit. And this is groping around in the darkness. It seems to me that gratitude is a form of faith. Mm-hmm. It's like a decision in some sense, because you could look at the world and you could say, well, there's plenty of reasons to be grateful and there's plenty of reasons not to be. And so the evidence doesn't necessarily support one interpretation or another, but a decision about whether or not to be grateful is going to affect the way I interpret the world, and also perhaps the way it reveals itself to me, and the way I act in it and the consequences of my action. So I would say it seems to me to take faith to be grateful, and that seems to be a worthwhile faith. It seems to me to take faith to operate always when we don't know what we're doing, and we usually don't know what we're doing. And so part of the reason that you have to have faith is because you're actually ignorant, and it fills in the gaps, right? Because otherwise you'd be stuck with a never-ending regress. You'd just ask why all the time, and then you could never act, because the why has to end somewhere. And I think virtually by definition, it ends with an act of faith. That might be akin to your idea about faith being beyond reason. It's like, well, look, if I ask you why you're having this conversation with me, you'll give me a reason. And if I ask you why that reason is valid, you'll give me another reason. And if I do that 5 or 6 times, you're going to run out of reasons. But you're still having the conversation. God. So that means you have faith that the conversation can go somewhere good. And that's not actually a delusion.
No. And actually, you're moving toward God. And I think that's a classic route in our tradition. And just the way you were doing it. Why are we having this conversation? I can give, these particular reasons, but then ask the why again, ask it a third, a fourth, a fifth time. Finally, I'm going to get to something like, well, because I want to be happy. What ultimately motivates the will is some desire for happiness. Well, no, what's happiness? Well, keep pressing that question. It can't be something simply in this world. We all know that doesn't make us happy in the way that we're seeking. It's something like the summum bonum, right? Something like the ultimate good. I want to be happy in the fullest possible sense all the time, which is why, Teilhard de Chardin said this, that I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning unless I believe in God. And that's what he meant, was if you do that kind of horizon analysis of every act of the will, even the simplest, like getting out of bed, you finally come to the summum bonum.